Howdy, y'all. The Cold War was a, well, somewhat turbulent time, but there was a lot of weapons development. A large part of the Cold War was an arms race, and the Cold War produced some impressive, terrifying, and sometimes even wacky weapons designs. Today, I want to show you three weird tank types from this time period that were either produced or prototyped, and I think you'll find it interesting. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button if you like what we're doing, and check out our Rumble channel too. The first tank that I want to talk about is the Object 279. Now, the Object 279 was a heavy tank prototype that could kind of be thought of as a continuation of doctrine or of thought process from the IS series of heavy tanks, or the Joseph Stalin series of heavy tanks. We've talked about one or two of those before. It was a very technologically advanced prototype for the time. It tried to integrate a lot of technologies that were actually pretty new, but also pretty capable. It had a very advanced drivetrain system that included the tracks, the four tracks that it had, being effectively on stilts. It mounted the four tracks on hollow beams that also doubled as places for the fuel tanks. You can see in the pictures, it has a very odd kind of setup. It looks almost like something from a drawing, and yet that's actually how it was designed. It was designed to have excellent cross-country performance, especially for a tank of its size, and solid speed too. It was hoped to be, or planned to be, designed to be a tank that could get where most other tanks couldn't. It mounted a 130 millimeter gun, which was quite a big tank gun for, well, really all of history. There's very few tanks that mounted a gun of similar caliber. And it had a 14.5 millimeter machine gun mounted as well. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, the 50 caliber, which is America and Russia both have a very ubiquitous 50 caliber machine gun that they use, is 12.7 millimeters in diameter. So a 14.5 millimeter machine gun is significantly larger. It had very thick armor that had an unusual shape to it. Part of this was it was covered in thin special panels that were designed to protect against heat and APDS rounds. So heat is high explosive anti-tank, APDS is armor piercing discarding sabot. And those, without getting too much into the details, are weapons that can be extremely effective at penetrating a large amount of armor, but it's very important that they contact the main amount of armor that they are trying to penetrate. So by creating a small armored shield where that warhead activates earlier than the armor, farther away from the armor than it's supposed to, its effectiveness is greatly reduced. The Object 279 did have protection systems against chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons called a CBRN system. But from what I've seen, the shape of the tank was not designed to withstand a nuclear blast directly. I've heard that story passed around, I believe, about this vehicle, that it was designed, and the reason the hull was shaped the way it was because it was supposed to withstand a nuclear blast. That, from what I can tell, is not true. If you happen to have some data to indicate otherwise, please put that down in the comments below and let me know. I'd love to take a look at it. Had this tank been produced and functioned like it was claimed it was supposed to function, and you do have to remember there's propaganda and some things in there at times, it likely would have been one of the most capable and advanced heavy tanks that's ever been made. But it was just a prototype. The next tank that I want to talk about is the STRV-103, or I'm probably going to butcher this pronunciation, but the Stridsvagn 103. Now, this was a very novel design by Sweden that melded the concept of a cased tank destroyer and a main battle tank. The vehicle was designed for high crew survivability and having a very low profile, which it certainly achieved. One of the ways that it achieved having a low profile was removing the turret completely. So it had a gun mounted in the hull, a 105 millimeter gun, and interestingly enough, not only was the gun mounted in the hull, it was also fixed in the hull. So this vehicle took some design inspiration from old vehicles in World War II, like the Stug 3 or those sorts of assault guns, but a lot of times the case-mounted, or casemate, assault guns or self-propelled guns had some traverse of the gun inside of its mounting. The STRV-103 did not, and aiming was done with a very high-quality drivetrain, a very high-quality and finely tuned drivetrain system, and the ability to elevate its tracks. So basically, it was able to aim the gun by moving the entire tank. A novel thing that oftentimes was not very effective, especially when it was first implemented. The STRV-103 was a very, very good implementation of it. Removing the turret not only reduced the profile, But removing the turret also reduced the cost and the weight of a vehicle that was very capable and very advanced. By really our definitions, we'd say it was a traditional tank destroyer, but it really wasn't. And the Swedish military didn't consider it that either. It was labeled as and implemented as a main battle tank, despite the fact that it looks like a modern version of an assault gun. Very interesting vehicle. If it had seen much action, I would guess, as long as it was deployed properly and had good crews, would have been a very effective vehicle. And then the last vehicle that I want to talk about for this round is the M50 Ontos. Now, the M50 Ontos is technically considered a tank destroyer, to be fair, but it has a turret, and you could easily class it as a tank. In fact, with a turret, you could more easily classify it as a tank than you could the STRV-103, ironically enough. This turret, though, did have a limited traverse. There were a couple versions that one had more traverse, one had less traverse. And the turret was very small. It was mainly to mount on struts the main weapons, which were 6 106 millimeter recoilless rifles. An interesting thing I found out about the 106 millimeter recoilless rifles, they're actually technically 105 millimeter, and the military wanted it classified as 106 because they had another older 105 millimeter recoilless rifle that they didn't want the ammos to get mixed up because the ammos were not compatible. It was very small, very, very small vehicle. It was designed to be air transportable. It also mounted 4 spotting guns, which they were mounted on 4 of the recoilless rifles, and those were spotting rifles, they're also called, or properly called, I should say. And those would shoot a tracer round that was the same velocity as the rounds that would be shot from the recoilless rifles. What that would do would mean that you could aim by using your spotting rifles and seeing where the tracers hit. If the tracers hit their intended target, then you knew that the recoilless rifles would as well. It also mounted a .30 caliber for defense against infantry. It had several disadvantages, though. Aside from its small size, although some of them stem from its small size, it had very low ammo storage. So it had 6 rounds in the guns, but it could only carry 18 rounds in the vehicle itself. So you could only reload about, 3 times? It also had to be reloaded from the outside, which probably seems obvious because these guns are basically just mounted on struts. From a conventional wisdom standpoint, it really probably shouldn't have been a very good vehicle. However, the Ontos actually was a Cold War vehicle that saw extensive action, and it saw a lot of action mainly in Vietnam, although it did see just a little bit of action somewhere else as well. And in Vietnam, it was reportedly extremely effective as a fire support vehicle, but they didn't use it against tanks a lot. The North Vietnamese army didn't even use tanks very much, or at least deploy them against American forces. And so it was used primarily as an infantry support vehicle, and the recoilless rifles, for such a small package, packed a lot of punch against infantry and structures. In fact, it was supposedly so effective that the sight of an Ontos was enough to scare off enemies from fighting positions frequently, or at least relatively frequently enough to note. So very interesting thing, and I think the Ontos is really cool, not just because it's very quirky and cool looking and it's intimidating with all the barrels and everything. I think it's also a really good example of how something that by classical standard, by statistical standard, should not be a very good vehicle was actually very effective in the role it was used, primarily because of deployment and the skill with which it was implemented, and not just raw statistical capability. So anyway, that's 3 weird tanks from the Cold War. There's actually many more that we'll hopefully get to eventually, and same with World War II, as we've done this video before for the Second World War. But I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope that you've found this little brief intro interesting, and I hope you're looking forward to some more. Don't forget about our merch store as well. We have some cool stuff there, and hopefully we'll have some more cool stuff in the future. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, we make a real difference in this whole world. Been Ryan Dalton, the Kentuckian, signing off.